The Cold War was not a single battle, but a global contest that shaped nearly every major international event after World War II. On one side stood the United States and its allies, generally committed to capitalism, liberal democracy, and open markets. On the other stood the Soviet Union and its allies, built around one-party communist rule and state-controlled economies. The strange part was that these two superpowers never fought each other directly in a declared war. Instead, they competed through alliances, weapons, spies, propaganda, technology, economic pressure, and wars fought by other countries. That is why it was called a Cold War. The conflict was real, dangerous, and often violent, but the central rivals avoided direct combat because direct combat could become nuclear war. The rivalry grew out of the wreckage of World War II. During the war, the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany, but that alliance was based more on necessity than trust. Once Germany was defeated in 1945, old suspicions returned quickly. Soviet armies occupied much of Eastern Europe, and Moscow helped install friendly communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. To Soviet leaders, this created a security buffer after the devastation of two German invasions in the 20th century. To Western leaders, it looked like expansion and domination. Europe, once united against Hitler, was now split between two competing systems. Winston Churchill famously described this division as an iron curtain descending across Europe. The phrase captured both geography and fear. In the West were countries tied increasingly to the United States, rebuilding capitalist economies and democratic institutions. In the East were states under Soviet influence, where opposition parties were weakened or eliminated and communist governments answered closely to Moscow. Germany became the clearest symbol of this split. It was divided into occupation zones, and Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, was also divided. What had begun as a temporary arrangement after the defeat of Nazi Germany turned into one of the most visible front lines of the Cold War. The United States answered Soviet influence with a strategy called containment. Announced through the Truman Doctrine in 1947, containment meant the United States would try to stop communism from spreading further, rather than simply retreating from global affairs after the war. This was not only a military strategy. In 1948, the Marshall Plan sent massive economic aid to Western Europe. The goal was to rebuild shattered economies, prevent political instability, and make communist movements less appealing. Washington believed poverty and chaos could create openings for Soviet influence. By helping Europe recover, the United States was also building a bloc of stable allies tied to American power. The first major crisis came in Berlin. In 1948, the Soviet Union blocked road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western powers out of the city. Instead of abandoning it, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, flying food, fuel, and supplies into the city for nearly a year. The blockade failed, but it hardened the Cold War division. In 1949, the United States and Western allies created NATO, a military alliance based on collective defense. The Soviet Union later responded with the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Europe was no longer just politically divided, it was organized into opposing armed camps. At the center of Cold War fear was the nuclear arms race. The United States had used atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, revealing a terrifying new kind of weapon. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly. From that point on, both sides built larger and more powerful arsenals, including hydrogen bombs and missiles capable of crossing continents. Nuclear weapons changed the logic of war. A direct conflict between the superpowers could destroy both societies. This idea became known as mutually assured destruction, peace maintained not by trust, but by the certainty that any nuclear attack would bring catastrophic retaliation. Because direct war was so dangerous, the Cold War often turned hot in other places. Korea was one of the first major examples. After World War II, Korea had been divided into a communist north backed by the Soviet Union and China, and an anti-communist south supported by the United States. In 1950, North Korea invaded the south, triggering a brutal war. United Nations forces, led by the United States, intervened for the south, while China eventually entered on the north side. After 3 years of fighting and millions of casualties, the war ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty. Korea remained divided, showing how local conflicts could become global Cold War battlegrounds. The Cold War also spread through newly independent countries in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. As European empires collapsed, many new nations tried to stay non-aligned, meaning they did not want to be controlled by either superpower. But both Washington and Moscow saw these countries as strategically important. They offered economic aid, weapons, training, and political support to friendly governments and movements. The United States often backed anti-communist regimes, including some dictatorships, if they opposed Soviet influence. The Soviet Union supported left-wing parties, revolutionary movements, and governments that challenged Western power. Decolonization gave many people freedom, but it also turned parts of the world into arenas of superpower competition. The most dangerous moment of the Cold War came in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba had undergone a communist revolution in 1959, bringing Fidel Castro to power just 90 miles from the United States. After the United States placed missiles in Europe and tried to isolate Cuba, the Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles to the island. When American reconnaissance discovered them, President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine and demanded their removal. For 13 tense days, the world seemed close to nuclear war. The crisis ended with a compromise. The Soviets removed missiles from Cuba, and the United States quietly removed missiles from Turkey. The lesson was clear: miscalculation could end civilization. Another defining Cold War conflict was Vietnam. The struggle there grew from anti-colonial war, civil conflict, and ideological rivalry. North Vietnam, led by communists, sought to unify the country, while South Vietnam was supported by the United States. American leaders feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow, an idea known as the domino theory. The United States sent troops, aircraft, and enormous resources, but faced determined resistance, difficult terrain, and growing opposition at home. In 1975, North Vietnam captured Saigon, and the war ended in a communist victory. For the United States, Vietnam showed the limits of military power in a political and nationalist struggle. The Cold War was not only fought with soldiers and missiles. It was also a contest for prestige. The space race became one of the most dramatic examples. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking the United States and proving that Soviet rockets could reach space. Soon both sides raced to achieve scientific firsts: satellites, human spaceflight, lunar missions, and advanced rocketry. When the United States landed astronauts on the moon in 1969, it was celebrated as a major victory of American technology and organization. Sports, film, education, and propaganda all became part of this symbolic struggle to prove which system represented the future. By the 1970s, both superpowers had reasons to reduce tensions. The nuclear arms race was expensive and dangerous, and neither side wanted constant crisis. This period became known as détente, a partial thaw in relations. The United States opened diplomatic relations with Communist China, taking advantage of the growing split between China and the Soviet Union. Washington and Moscow also signed arms control agreements that limited certain nuclear weapons. But détente never meant friendship. The rivalry continued through espionage, influence campaigns, and regional wars. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and political upheavals in Iran and Nicaragua helped bring tensions back, reminding the world that the Cold War had only cooled, not ended. The final phase began inside the Soviet system itself. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union and introduced reforms meant to revive a struggling economy and loosen political control. His policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, created space for criticism and change. But once people in Eastern Europe saw that Moscow would no longer automatically crush reform movements, communist governments began to fall. In 1989, revolutions swept through the Eastern Bloc, and the Berlin Wall came down. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War ended not with a superpower battlefield victory, but with economic strain, political reform, and the collapse of Soviet authority. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.